I'm Anna Rose, the Exhibition and Programming Associate at the Wende. Thanks so much for joining us today for Cold War Spaces. Today's topic is culinary space, debates, and practices. A lot of us this year are staying home and turning to cooking this year in lieu of our normal Thanksgiving traditions, so we're in for a historical kitchen-themed treat with today's discussion. Our guest today is Jon Verriet. He's a cultural historian and PhD student at Radboud University, and his dissertation is called Fitter, Stronger, Faster: The Athlete's Diet and the Pursuit of Healthy Lifestyles in the Netherlands and the UK, 1945 to 2016. This program will be about a 30-minute conversation between Jon and Joes Segal, the Wende's Chief Curator and Director of Programming. After that, we leave about 15 minutes for Q&A, so please get your questions ready to put in the Q&A box during that time. We appreciate everyone's questions, but please ask that you keep them short and concise, no longer than a sentence or two. For any other comments or discussion among yourselves, please use the chat box. And as we get started, feel free to say hi. And it's always nice to see what city people are tuning in from. And we'll be posting today's recording on our Vimeo page afterwards. And you can find the recordings of all of our virtual programming there. Lastly, I'd like to thank Susan Horwitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting discussion series at the Wende and our virtual programs. And Joes, I'll hand it off to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna Rose. So after a series of more politically oriented interviews around the elections, today we're focusing on cultural history. And as Anna Rose mentioned, inspired by Thanksgiving, we are going to talk about Cold War food history. How did people prepare their meals during the Cold War? How did food relate to cultural traditions and national identities? How could recipes be used for political messaging? And from a post-Cold War perspective, how do certain dishes cater to feelings of deprivation and nostalgia? I'm very happy to discuss these questions with Jon, whose MA thesis in cultural history at Utrecht University I had the pleasure to supervise, and who taught me a lot about food culture as a unique and rich historical source. So Jon, welcome to Cold War Spaces.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with one of the central moments of early Cold War history. Apart from many other things, the Cold War was a competition of consumer cultures. And at the American National Exhibition in 1959, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev and American Vice President Richard Nixon engaged in what has been called the kitchen debate, discussing, among other things, the quality and accessibility of household appliances. Can you tell us a little bit about the context of the kitchen debate and why it became such an iconic moment of Cold War history?
Sure, yeah. Okay, let me share my screen. I think we have a picture as well. So this is the end of the 1950s. So this is a period of relative ease between the two countries. I mean, Stalin is dead, and now Khrushchev is the general secretary, and it's a period where both countries are trying to sort of claim that they have their ideology or their economic system is the better one. And here, international observers sort of saw Nixon using this kitchen, and I'll talk a bit more about the kitchen, but this kitchen as sort of the argument for why capitalism was better. And the kitchen, this sort of thing, these kitchens and these exhibitions of like kitchens or even whole American houses wasn't necessarily a new thing. For instance, this is in 1957. We see this miracle kitchen that sort of travels all through Europe. And the idea was that these was very nice kitchens, very nice to look at, very modern, very lots of interesting new inventive technology. And the argument Nixon made during this famous kitchen debate was, this is what every American is able to afford, and this is what our economic system also sort of affords to everyone.
Right. So speaking about Khrushchev, he also played a role in trying to deal with food shortages during the early Cold War years, the 1950s, early 1960s, inspired by what he saw happening in agriculture in the United States. So I think there is especially an interesting history about Khrushchev's believe in corn as a solution to those food shortages. Do you have some backgrounds there? Can you tell
Yeah,
us a
yeah.
little bit?
Actually, I'm laughing, but it's a very serious matter. But I have some funny pictures of just to bring some levity to the conversation. Yeah, Khrushchev was contacted by a farmer from Iowa, Mr. Garst, Mr. Roswell Garst, and he was convinced this was sort of, he saw himself as a sort of a food diplomat. And we see him on the black and white picture on the right, the man with his mouth wide open. And he was convinced that not just the Soviet Union, but all countries would benefit from new kinds of breeding techniques and new kinds of, or new varieties of corn, and thereby greatly increase their productivity. And eventually, I mean, corn was usually used as animal fodder, so eventually then these countries would be able to eat much more protein, and therefore have like protein was seen as sort of the way to build a strong and vigorous nation. And Khrushchev was very much a believer of this corn as sort of the savior of the Soviet nation. People started calling him the corn man, which admittedly isn't very original, but in the end, sadly, the whole corn adventure for Khrushchev sort of backfired, because apparently it was sort of successful, but not successful enough, and people had big expectations. And there was a crop failure in the beginning of the 60s, and it was actually seen as one of his biggest mistakes for putting all his eggs in one basket, in the corn basket, so to say.
Right. Do you think did that actually contribute to his downfall?
Well, this is the famous sort of the most historians always point to food prices when they talk about like regime change or revolutions. I mean, the famous example is the French Revolution, where bread prices rose, etc. And I think it's probably did have a lot to do with food prices rising at the time, and there were even some strikes, and there was even a massacre where dozens of people were killed in Novocherkassk. I'm not very good at pronouncing Russian names. In 1962, so I think the maybe not. It was of course not the only reason, but maybe it was a good way of getting rid of Khrushchev. Yeah.
Right. So in your MA thesis, you also wrote about frozen foods and ready meals. And of course, in the 1950s, 1960s, apart from new kitchen appliances, these were elements that were supposed to make the life of women in that time, who were supposed to take care of household tasks, including cooking, a little bit easier. Can you tell us about the introduction of these frozen foods, ready meals, etc., and how they impacted cooking rituals? Also, maybe how critics were critical about this introduction of new kinds of cooking.
Yeah, so the 1950s and especially the 1960s and 70s were a crucial period for sort of food innovation. So there were lots of new ways of storing and keeping food well. So think of freeze drying, etc. But it was especially a period where existing technologies such as canning and frozen foods, they sort of were popularized, and it became much more affordable. And now I'm of course mostly talking about countries to the west of the Iron Curtain. So this was a period where frozen foods, etc., became abundant in countries like the Netherlands, countries like Belgium, countries like France, like England, and also the US, of course. But the US is a little earlier, even before the Second World War. Frozen foods sort of start to make inroads. In socialist countries, it wasn't affordable to many, although canned food was sort of seen in a very positive light. So canned food was sort of seen as this way to reduce cooking times, and of course, as cooking was sort of seen as this distraction from the actual work, actual revolutionary work. It was sort of this drudge for of course mostly women at the time. I have a picture as well, I think. So on the right, we see this very famous cookery book that had many editions that was published in the Soviet Union, and we see that the sort of this idealization of canned and potted foods that sort of help to reduce cooking times and to make it easier. And actually, socialists in Western countries as well. For instance, there's this dissertation on Belgian cooking, and in Belgium, socialists magazines sort of wrote about canned foods that they might help liberate women from the drudgery of the kitchen.
Right. Was there also a backlash against?
Yeah. Particularly, this is something I researched in the Netherlands, and there was definitely a backlash because, especially the 1950s, but also in the Netherlands at least, still the 1960s and part of the 1970s, it was primarily women who were responsible for cooking, of course, and the demands made on women with respect to cooking were higher than ever. So the idea of just sort of spooning an entire meal from a can, that really didn't go over well. So there was a definite backlash, this sort of taboo of using convenience. And here on the left, we actually see a very nice sort of solution. One of the most famous marketing examples of the 20th century, which is this solution that Betty Crocker came up with. And this is that they had this cake mix, and it sort of, you didn't have to add anything. I think you only had to add water. But this sort of, it didn't sell well because you basically, it just promoted laziness, and laziness was very, was not okay. And so what they came up with, they removed the egg powder, and they told women to add the egg themselves. And so that sort of gave the idea that you were still cooking and we're still doing your best for your family.
Yeah. Right. So speaking about the role of women in the kitchen, do you see a change over the decades of the Cold War that the division of tasks becomes a little bit more equal, or things are changing in the way recipes, for instance, are presented towards both male and female readers, viewers?
Well, yes and no. I think, like I said, cooking has always been a very much a gendered practice, and it's been that way on both sides of the Iron Curtain. But it's also been presented, especially in the West, from let's say the 1970s onwards, with the second wave of feminism. It's been sort of presented as a problem as well. This division of roles. So whether you were sort of liberal or more collectivist, the idea that women were unfree or not able to have their individual pursuits, but have stuck to the kitchen, that was a sort of a problem for both observers in the West and in the East. So you do see, but if you look at, like, I mean, most recipes were in the publications that even featured recipes were gendered. I mean, these were women's magazines. Men's magazines didn't have recipes. And if you look at the language, it's even in the 70s and in the 80s, it's still mostly focused on women. And the one day a year that men were allowed in the kitchen was Mother's Day. On Mother's Day, it was supposed to be men who were doing the cooking, and these magazines sort of wrote sort of this amused about men in the kitchen, and they gave these foolproof recipes. But it's very gendered, and it doesn't really, it's remarkable how it doesn't really change that much over the 70s and 80s.
Right. So I think both in the East and the West, there were strong state campaigns to promote healthy foods, diets, also campaigns against alcohol abuse and things like that. Can you tell us a little bit about those campaigns and the impact they had?
Yeah, so this is a part of the focus of my current research project, and there was sort of a throughout the Cold War, there was a transnational consensus, you might say, about how incredibly important healthy eating was. So there was, whether it was Soviet administrators or governmental officers in the West, everyone agreed that it was very important to eat healthily. And for instance, in the Netherlands, I've looked at this sort of this nutrition education board, and they really try their best to sort of promote this healthy lifestyle, not just by eating more healthy, but also by exercising. And you have the same in the US, for instance. I think Eisenhower already starts with a sort of a sports program, and then Kennedy continues it, etc. There's this whole physical education sort of movement, and it also goes about, it's of course in the West it's about obesity. Obesity becomes this sort of the problem of the West, and especially by the 70s and 80s, obesity and the lack of physical exercise is seen as a massive problem. I have just two examples here of newspapers sort of playfully addressing the issue. Right. Of course, in the East, the problem was much different, because while, for instance, while in the Netherlands, people were starting to eat much more sugar. I think I have a figure somewhere. Let me see, because it's quite telling. Yeah, in the Netherlands. So in the Netherlands in 1957 already, people were eating 43, or no, I'll tell you in pounds, 95 pounds of sugar per capita per year. So about 100 pounds of sugar per year. And in the Soviet Union, about in 8 years later, it was still about 20 pounds less. And one other trend that's very interesting is that while the Dutch started to eat less vegetables in the post-war period, the Soviets actually started to eat much more vegetables. So healthy eating was seen as very important, but the health, sort of the issues that government officials focused on were very different. So, and as you mentioned, one of the main issues in the Soviet Union was alcoholism. Which wasn't new, by the way. It wasn't, I mean, this had always been a problem, even in Tsarist Russia. And there was also this sort of, the state was also sort of disincentivized to do something about it, because during the 19th century, almost 30% of all taxes came from taxes on alcohol consumption. So there's this sort of this long relationship with alcohol and alcoholism that was sort of inherited by the Soviets, and they did try to do. They did have these public campaigns about trying to reduce alcohol consumption, but they weren't very successful. And these are just some of the. I mean, the designs are beautiful. I don't think the designs were the problem.
Right. I would like to talk a bit about the connections between food and national identities or cultural traditions. So, do you think that there are interesting examples where food was discussed in terms of national pride, national identity? And can you also tell us a little bit about the impact of the growth of exotic food staples, but also international cuisines, international restaurants that came up? How did that impact the thinking about food and maybe also the openness towards other cultures?
Yeah, let me see. So of course, food has, particularly from the 19th century onwards, it's been very much brought into connection with national identity and with national pride. And I think we still see that today. I think all of everyone in our audience can think of like food. I mean, we're gonna discuss Thanksgiving probably. There's lots of foods to feel some sense of national pride about. What's interesting during the Cold War is that particularly in the East, so in Eastern Europe as well, in the Soviet Union, food is sort of course, there's very, very diverse sort of food cultures within that entire block of countries. So what they really weren't able to do was sort of present this one national cuisine, like everyone, like there's this sort of communist cuisine or whatever. That didn't really happen. So what they did was sort of this, from a propaganda standpoint, of course, they did this sort of united in diversity thing. So they had like, they had all sorts of different kind of regional and sort of local traditions. And instead of sort of brushing those away, they sort of celebrated all these different traditions. Something that you also see in a lot of countries that are very multicultural, multi-ethnic. Let's say Indonesia, for instance, also has this sort of idea that their cuisine is so strong because it is so diverse. And that's also, of course, a metaphor. The country itself is also so strong because they are so diverse.
Right. Do you think that actually helped provoke a certain amount of tolerance or interest in other cultures? Or is that too vague to?
No, I think it's a good question. I think I'm just skeptical about it. Also because, of course, there is a propaganda element to it, and I think it's still used today. And I work at the Department of Sports History, and with sport you see the exact same thing. It's often used as this sort of, we're bringing people together sort of argument, sort of brushing away the hooliganism and the intense rivalries, etc. And I think the same goes with food. I mean, it depends on where you want to look. I think at least in the Netherlands, there is this sort of interest in foreign cuisines that is not particular to the Netherlands. You see that in all over the world, from particularly the 1960s and 70s, people sort of start to get bored with their own cuisine, especially in the Netherlands, which doesn't really have a cuisine of its own. And I mean, you might say that Americans sort of are familiar with that, but I don't want to step on any toes. So let's just say the Netherlands doesn't really have a national cuisine, or it's not very famous. So
you're not stepping on any toes, I would say. This is a well-known fact.
Yeah, okay. So, well, there are some national dishes maybe, but there's not really a national cuisine. And so the Dutch start looking abroad, and they particularly start looking towards Southeast Asia, start looking toward Indonesia. But I think it's not really a sign of any intensification of interest in those people in general, or in foreign cultures in general. It's more about boredom in the kitchen. And one of the examples that I found is that, for instance, this director of the most famous Dutch colonial foods company, which is called Conimex, is now part of Unilever. And this director, after working for decades for that company, he remarked in 1972 that he was going to use his retirement to visit Indonesia for the first time. And he even remarks, "Oh, I'm gonna see what it tastes like over there." So he'd been the head of a company that sold only Indonesian food for decades, and he had never been to Indonesia.
That's wild. That's amazing. Do you know of any examples where foods or specific recipes were used in a political way? I'm thinking, for instance, of state dinners and occasions like that.
Yeah. That's another thing. So usually, this is sort of a side note, but usually food is depoliticized. So particularly because it falls in the realm of lifestyle, coziness, and we want to keep things civil, and we want to keep things fun. So this, for instance, is from a Dutch women's magazine, which sort of, I think it's from 1970. And they present dinner with the big five, and the text says something like, okay, we might not be as they liberated us 25 years ago, and now maybe we're not as big as friends with some of them as we are with others, but you should just forget about that and just make these meals and then see who you like best. But of course, let me go back. Yeah, so there is this tendency to politicized dishes, and one of the most famous examples when it comes to the Cold War is chicken Kiev. I don't know if our audience is familiar with it, but I think they might be. It's basically a very fancy chicken nugget with some butter inside. I'm not doing the dish any favors, I know, but it's quite tasty. And so chicken Kiev was this sort of, became this symbol of not just Soviet cuisine, or even a little bit fancy Soviet cuisine. It's actually sort of a Russian or even a French-Russian invention. And it was served at many state dinners. So in the 40s, in the 50s, and then it was served in 1990 as Gorbachev visited the Soviet embassy in Washington. And there was even a chicken Kiev speech made by George Bush, so George Bush Sr., where he told Ukrainians, and this was in 1991, he told Ukrainians to be careful about wishing for independence.
Wow.
And this was termed, in the press, they called this the chicken Kiev speech.
Right, right. And do you know, of course, Thanksgiving is a very famous food-related ritual, so to speak. Do you know of any specific Cold War era food traditions?
Yeah. Actually, here the catalog of the Wende Museum was actually helpful, because you guys have some great material on this. And on the left, we see this tradition of drinking coffee, and coffee was apparently very expensive. I mean, real coffee was very expensive in most Soviet countries and in most countries in the Eastern Bloc. So people might not be drinking coffee, but they might be drinking these imitation coffees made with other like dried peas, etc. And on the left, we see this advertisement for coffee, and it was also associated with doing a bit of gossiping while you were drinking coffee. And on the right, we see this one I really like, and I was actually curious, Joes, whether you played this game, because you guys had this in Los Angeles, right? Have you played the Wir Sammeln Pilze game?
I haven't played it myself.
Ah, that's a shame. So it's basically a board game for children, I think, and it's about foraging. So foraging was, and not because people were so hungry that they had to forage, but foraging was in parts of Eastern Europe and in Russia, it was a cultural tradition. And mushrooms especially, of course, you need to know about which mushrooms you're gonna forage before you start out. So that's why you have the board game. But mushrooms were a part of the cuisine, and you see references to foraging as well in lots of cookbooks from Eastern Europe.
Right, right. It's about time to go to the Q&A, but before we do so, I would like to ask you one last question about the time after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, where we see in part rise of nostalgic feelings for lost cultures, so to speak. What role did food and taste play in those experiences and feelings of nostalgia?
Yeah, so it's funny actually that it says a lot about food in the communist era. I think that a nostalgia for food, or for communist food or Soviet food or Soviet cuisine was absent from nostalgia about communism for a long time. So nostalgia about communism starts basically in 1991 or even earlier. But nostalgia about communist food is somewhat absent from that. But now, more recently, we do see that well, we shouldn't say food particularly. Here we see this restaurant chain in Moscow that does this. But it's more about the aesthetics, the Soviet aesthetics, and it's not actually the food these kinds of restaurants serve, because it's not just particular to Moscow. They have these restaurants in all over Eastern Europe, but the food they serve isn't very. I mean, it's not drab and it's not very cheap. This is a gentrified, not very cheap, a yuppie version of Soviet. So it's an imagined history instead of an actual history.
Right, as is often the case, I would argue, with the nostalgia. Yeah. Okay, so let's go to the Q&A, and please put your questions in the Q&A box. That's where I'm looking, not under chat. And there is already one question by Bruce Hollihan, who asks, I once asked a Soviet emigre friend when was his happiest time in the USSR. He said that was when Khrushchev made French cheese available to the masses. Despite modern culinary production advances, I prefer traditional methods. What do you think?
So this is the question, what my opinion is about French cheese, because I'm very much in favor of French cheese. I do think.
Yeah, but also about traditional methods, I think.
Yeah, I think traditional method. It depends on the product you're making, but in the case of French cheese, I would have to side with traditional methods. I think. Yeah, I agree.
Are you an avid cook yourself?
This is a question I often get, and that it is. I sort of started getting into food history mainly because I figured that if something was a hobby of mine and I was studying history, that I could simply combine the two. So yeah, I do like to cook. I've never made French. Well, I made goat cheese once, but it wasn't a success. It's very hard to make cheese, actually, or at least it wasn't easy for me.
Right, okay. I see there are maybe some questions in the chat box. So I see one here. Please, though, do put your questions under the Q&A box. Marty Zisner writes, did Cold War fresh food shortages in Russia and Eastern Europe adversely affect the health along the lines of what the Dutch endured eating tulip bulbs in 1944?
That's a very good question. Russia and Eastern Europe, it's a big place, of course. So I mean, there was a famine in the Soviet Union I think in 46, 47, so even after the war. And there were serious crop failures throughout the post-war period. But the sort of hunger that people became familiar with during the Second World War, mostly no. And also there were huge differences between regions and between nations. So it's hard to sort of paint that answer with a broad brush.
Right. Lorraine Petzela writes, I have had chicken Kiev. It's not easy to make.
I can imagine, yeah, because you have a chicken breast, but you have to sort of fold the butter in, and then you sort of bread it with eggs and bread, and then you fry it, right? Yeah. Right. Yeah. Okay. It sounds good though.
Next question is from Geneva Rengel. You spoke to the projected women's role in the kitchen during this time. I read once that the US really pushed the perception of women in the kitchen in the 1950s to show how anti-Soviet Union they were and to really contrast the USSR. Have you come across anything like this propaganda in your research?
So the idea is that the relationship between or sort of let's say the idea that cooking is a waste of time and that it doesn't help women liberate themselves, or it doesn't help the revolution, is not an idea that was sort of invented by the Soviets or whatever in the 1970s. This is a very old idea. The idea that basically all housework is a sort of it doesn't really help the advance towards communism. So this is. And the idea that women were unfree, or the idea that one of those beautiful kitchens that we saw sort of locked in women as well, instead of liberating them, that was an idea that was sort of used against Western countries as well. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know if that answers your question. But...
next question is from Laura Isherwood, well known to both of us. The Soviet Union is so large. Any meals that were eaten everywhere across all of these many borders? And how about rituals that are connected to these foods?
It's a good question. It's a difficult question for me because you're right. It is a very, very big place, and you have these wildly different food traditions, and you have Islamic regions. Where people, of course, have completely different food and also drink traditions from other places. You have wine drinking regions. So I think the differences were huge. And if you look at Soviet era cookbooks, like I said, they sort of try to popularize certain regional classics. But I think it very much depended on whether you could get those ingredients as well. So it's hard to imagine that there were dishes, unless they were very, very simple. it's hard to imagine that there were dishes that were eaten throughout that. I mean, you're talking about Eastern Asia to Poland. I mean, and this is a huge region. So probably not a lot of dishes that we're eating throughout that region.
And it's a fascinating point, though, because on the one hand, there were these attempts to focus on national identity in the different Soviet republics, also to separate themselves a little bit from centralist ideas from Moscow. But then on the other hand, the state very much wanted to emphasize the connection between all of the Soviet citizens. So it would be interesting to see how that plays out in food cultures within the Soviet Union. Next question is by Olaf Hofland. Thank you very much, Jon and Joes. I enjoyed this conversation. I was wondering how much the Cold War actually influenced many of the developments you have spoken about. Canning, freezing, eating out, self-service restaurants. These were phenomena that predated and made advances before the Cold War and confrontation between the socialist and capitalist world. To what extent is the Cold War a sort of catalyst for the wider diffusion?
Oh, that's a difficult question. I think, generally speaking, the economic developments in Western countries are much more relevant to the popularization of canned foods, and especially the technological innovations, because even technologies like canned foods that were maybe, I mean, canned foods were invented in the early 19th century, but they still sort of started to, I mean, the cans were getting thinner all the time. So there were still technological advances being made even far into the 1980s and 1990s. And these technologies, they sort of, they kept going because there was a lot was being invested in them. And this is sort of the capitalist logic of trying to reduce spending, trying to increase revenue. So I think it's more about the economic system in the West and the product innovation there, and it's not necessarily the Cold War. I mean, the way of living, of course, and how it was presented, like modern foods and trying to be modern in the kitchen as well, like we said, that was very much a presented also as sort of this Cold War, this ideology, like this is what's going to liberate us. This is what's going to set us free.
Right. So at this point, there are no more questions under the Q&A, which gives me the opportunity, because we still have a little time, to ask you something I'm very curious about. And that is if you know of any examples where food traditions or specific recipes were contested in terms of their origin, in terms of their meaning. Also, if you can think of any examples where certain cuisines or certain recipes were appropriated, giving another meaning in another context.
Yeah. Well, the list is endless, really. I mean, I think if we ask our audience, I think they can probably come up with contested foods as well. I'll name just some. I think there's this huge fight between Australia and New Zealand over who invented pavlova. Hummus. It's usually also the countries fighting over a type of food usually don't really, or at least the governments don't really particularly like each other already. So hummus, of course, between Lebanon and Israel mainly. Falafel is discussed, frog legs, jollof rice in West Africa. Basically, every West African country claims jollof rice. And halloumi is also a famous one. So there are many, and the problem with these kinds of fights or this strife is that it's very hard to prove where a recipe actually is from. I mean, you usually, even if there's a recipe book is just proof that someone, let's say from New Zealand, wrote it down first, but that doesn't really tell us anything. Right. So if you're talking about like historical practice, it's very hard to get a sense of who was actually the person and where that person actually was when it was invented. And then you have the sort of the second problem where you can discuss whether what's the essence of a dish. So for instance, is ravioli, is it just another kind of dumpling, or is ravioli like an entire new invention? And is chicken Kiev, is that sort of a play on already existing haute cuisine French dishes, or is it like a completely new thing?
Right.
So there are lots of food fights. Also, of course, because they want to get on the UNESCO World Intangible Heritage List with these foods, but also because there's usually a commercial reason as well. So in Europe, for instance, you have these this European denomination where you can get this sort of like, for instance, balsamic vinegar or Parma ham or whatever. So you can get this denomination, and this region is the only region that's allowed to make the real Parma ham.
Right.
So it's also it can mean a lot of money for a certain region as well.
Yeah. Of course, the same with champagne, wine, and things like that. So.
Exactly. There's loads of examples. And so, for instance, halloumi, I think Cyprus is arguing, but has been arguing for some time, that halloumi is typically a Cyprus specialty, and that Cyprus should be the only one allowed to make cheese that is actually called halloumi. I'm not sure if they're winning. The discussion is ongoing.
Right. We have another question from Mary McVean. Russians I know who live in Los Angeles say the food here is nothing compared with what they ate in the USSR. That the produce there is so much better than ours. Is that just a love of home?
That's a good question. I think you'd have to, once COVID is over, you'd have to join them in a trip to Russia, because I've been to Russia once. I've been to the US, but not to LA. So I couldn't really tell you. It probably might be a little bit of both. I can imagine that if you're, it depends on the goods, of course. And I can imagine that certain specialties, or let's say herring, for instance, or other sturgeon or whatever, there are, of course, foods that perhaps Russians or Soviets in general were much more familiar with. And I can imagine that they also may have tasted better. And especially if it's produced in Russia, then there is a chance that if it doesn't have to travel by plane and it doesn't have to take a couple of days, that maybe some things definitely did taste better.
Right. So it's 1:45, but I have to ask you one final question. Do you have any tips, last-minute tips for Thanksgiving dinners?
Primarily, I'd say stay safe, and don't celebrate it with too many people.
Right.
And yeah, I don't know. You mean food-wise?
I thought food-wise, yeah. But,
maybe pardon a turkey and go vegetarian this year. But if you like meat, go ahead. I mean, it's just one day a year.
Yeah.
Maybe
pardon any more turkeys. That would be a good one.
Yeah. I'm not very familiar. I know about Thanksgiving food, like mashed potatoes and sweet potatoes and pumpkin pie, but I think you just have to make the traditional stuff, right? You can't really play around with it, or can you? You're not really allowed, right?
No, that's true.
Maybe now that not all family members will be there, you actually might be able to get a bit more creative. So maybe this is the year where you sort of try these sort of weird hybrid versions of pumpkin pie and etc.
Okay, Jon, I want to thank you very much for a very lively and fun conversation.
I had fun. Thanks.
Okay, so next week my guest is British historian Professor Tony Shaw, who specializes in the history of propaganda and cinema, and we will talk about Hollywood's Cold War and how the film industry helped shape the American Cold War narrative, but also helped to subvert it subsequently. So I think that will be interesting. I would like to wish everyone a wonderful and safe Thanksgiving and hope to see you next week. Bye-bye.